Welcome to SDN Tech Networking Podcast, world's first human-curated AI podcast where we break down complex topics into bite-sized, easy-to-digest pieces.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're taking a deep dive today into the world of enterprise Wi-Fi.
Sounds good.
I know you're probably thinking, oh, come on, not another deep dive on Wi-Fi, right? I deal with this stuff every day. But trust me.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of our bread and butter.
Exactly, you live and breathe this stuff. But even with everyday familiarity, there's always something new to uncover in the world of wireless tech. So consider this your crash course on acing those tricky deployments, especially in the wild world of controller-based systems.
Yeah, we'll try to share some of the insights that we've come across that might not be obvious, just from reading product data sheets.
Totally.
Right.
No deep dive is complete without laying some groundwork. Okay, so frequencies. 2.4 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, and the new kid on the block, 6 gigahertz.
Everyone's favorite.
I know. You'd encounter these every day.
Right.
But let's break down why they matter beyond just the gigabit this or megabit that we often hear.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to think about with those frequencies is not just the speed that they offer, but also their sort of strengths and weaknesses in different environments, right? So like that 2.4 gigahertz band, it's great. It's got great range, but it can get real crowded.
Yeah, definitely.
Especially in dense environments.
Like a crowded coffee shop or something.
Exactly.
And then we have 5 gigahertz, more bandwidth.
Right. More speed.
Faster speeds, but shorter range.
Right. That's the classic trade-off.
Classic trade-off stack.
Yeah.
So that's where I think it gets really interesting because, I think some people might just assume, oh, higher frequency better. But it's not always the case if your signal can't even reach.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think we were looking at, one of the sources that we were looking at for this episode was a video on sdntechforum. I thought they did a really good job explaining this whole concept of, how that 5 gigahertz with the shorter wavelength, how it struggles to kind of get through walls and stuff compared to 2.4.
Yeah, it's like trying to squeeze through a crowd versus having this nice, clear path.
Exactly.
But higher frequency doesn't always equal better if your signal can't even reach its destination.
And that's where 6 gigahertz, I think, is really interesting because it tries to be the best of both worlds, right? It's got more spectrum, which is great, for those high bandwidth applications, but it also can penetrate walls a little better. So, I mean, it's early days for 6 gigahertz, but it's definitely a one to watch.
Yeah, exciting times. Okay, so we've got our highways of data, but how do we actually get the information flowing? Modulation techniques?
Oh, right. Well, think of modulation as like the language of Wi-Fi.
Okay.
It's how we translate that data into those radio waves that our devices can understand. And, back in the early days, we had things like DSSS, which, it's kind of like sending smoke signals. It works, but it's a little slow, prone to interference.
And then OFDM came along.
Right. OFDM is like it's where it's at. OFDM is like the
language of the future.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really interesting when you look at how it actually works. And, the document that we have on that does a really good job of explaining it. Basically, the idea is that you're taking that data and you're splitting it across these multiple subcarriers.
Okay.
So it's like having, instead of having one big conversation, you've got these multiple conversations happening at the same time.
Right.
Which means you can transmit more information simultaneously. You can overcome that interference much better.
That's amazing. So it's like we're sending these multiple conversations all at the same time, but everyone can still understand each other, which is amazing.
Yeah, and it's much more efficient.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so OFDM, definitely a game changer. All right, so we've got our frequencies and modulation techniques down. Feels like we're speaking fluent Wi-Fi here. Now let's shift gears a bit to something I know is near and dear to every network engineer's heart. Controller-based enterprise Wi-Fi. It's a whole different ballgame compared to managing just a few standalone APs, right?
It really is. With controller base, we're talking about bringing in a central authority to manage all those access points instead of them just doing their own thing.
Right, like the conductor of the Wi-Fi orchestra.
Yeah.
But why go through the trouble? What's the real value for someone out there deploying and managing these networks every day?
Imagine trying to configure like hundreds of APs individually, one by one. Talk about a nightmare.
Don't even get me started. I've been there.
With a controller, you can push those configurations, firmware updates, even security policies to all your APs at once from one place.
Okay, now that's what I'm talking about. Saves so much time and headache, especially when you're on a tight deadline. And what about keeping an eye on everything once it's up and running? Does the controller help with that too?
Oh, absolutely. Centralized monitoring, troubleshooting, you even get proactive alerts. Instead of chasing down issues across a million different APs,
Right.
you get this nice bird's eye view of the health of your whole network.
It's like having X-ray vision for your Wi-Fi. You can pinpoint those problems instantly.
Exactly. And that kind of visibility is so key when you're dealing with a massive, complicated network like you find in a big enterprise. You can catch those issues before they become major meltdowns. You can see where you might have coverage gaps.
Right.
You can even fine-tune the performance based on what's actually happening in real time.
Okay, all this centralized control sounds amazing, but I do have one concern. What happens if the controller itself decides to take a nosedive? Isn't that a major single point of failure?
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
But that's where things like redundancy and having a good failover mechanism come in. You know that technical document we were looking at? They actually had some really good advice on this.
Right.
Like if you have a backup controller ready to go, then if your main one goes down,
Right.
the backup can kick in seamlessly and it minimizes the disruption to the network.
Gotcha. So it's all about making sure you've got those safety nets in place.
Yeah.
Now, what about security? I'm guessing there's a lot more to it than just coming up with a really strong password.
You got it. Having that controller lets you enforce really strong security policies across your entire Wi-Fi network. Things like dividing up your network into segments.
Yeah.
Having those access control lists, even intrusion detection, it can all be managed from that central point.
So instead of each AP fending for itself, you're creating these layers of security.
Exactly. And because you can push out updates and security patches to all the APs from the controller,
Right.
it really makes managing that security aspect a lot smoother.
Yeah, no more running around to each individual access point, making sure they're all up to date. It all comes back to that centralized control.
Exactly. And as Wi-Fi becomes even more crucial for everything we do,
Right.
and those networks get more and more complex, that centralized approach is going to become absolutely essential, I think.
It's like the glue that holds the whole Wi-Fi world together.
I like that. Yeah, the glue.
So we've talked a lot about the good stuff,
Yeah.
but I do want to make sure we're being realistic here.
Yeah.
Are there any downsides to controller-based systems that people should be aware of before they jump in head first?
You know, it's funny you should mention that because I was just watching a video on sdntechforum, and they were talking about that exact thing.
Yep.
One thing they highlighted was the learning curve.
Okay.
It can be a little steeper than with standalone APs because there's just more to it.
Right. It's not just plug and play and you're good to go.
Right, exactly. You really got
You have
to.
to put the time in.
Yeah, you got to get familiar with how these things work, how to configure them, troubleshoot them.
Right.
And that kind of ties into the other thing that comes to mind, which is vendor lock-in. When
Yeah.
you go with a controller-based system,
Right.
you're basically hitching your wagon to that particular vendor's ecosystem.
Right. Right.
Now, for some people, that's fine. They're happy with their vendor.
Right.
But it's definitely something to keep in mind for the long term.
Yeah, you don't want to get stuck down the line and realize you painted yourself into a corner.
Exactly.
All right, so let's bring all this home now. Put it into practice.
Okay.
Let's say you're tasked with designing the Wi-Fi network for a massive office building, right? Hundreds of employees, multiple floors, conference rooms, the whole 9 yards.
Okay.
How would you use what we've talked about today to build a really awesome Wi-Fi experience?
Well, first off, I'd want to really understand what those employees need from their Wi-Fi, right?
Okay.
Are they mostly just browsing the web, checking email, or are they doing more demanding stuff like video conferencing or transferring large files?
Sure, got to know your users.
Exactly. And that'll help me figure out what mix of frequencies I need, right? Like how much 2.4 gigahertz versus 5 gigahertz, maybe even some 6 gigahertz if we're feeling really fancy.
Love it. Yeah, got to think about that future-proofing.
For sure. And then, I mean, we've been talking about it this whole time, but I would definitely leverage the controller to make the deployment process way easier, right? Imagine pre-configuring all those APs from one central location.
Oh, yeah.
That's a huge time saver.
Huge time saver, yeah.
And once the network's up and running, having that centralized monitoring and troubleshooting,
Yeah.
that's going to be essential for keeping things running smoothly.
It's like having your finger on the pulse, you know.
Exactly. You know exactly what's going on at all times. And of course, security is huge, right? So I'd make sure to put in really strong security policies using the controller to enforce those policies across every single AP on the network.
Yeah, I got to keep those bad actors out.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like if you do it right, a controller-based system can really take your Wi-Fi game to the next level.
I really think so. It's all about finding that balance between performance,
Right.
security,
And of course,
and making sure it can grow with your needs.
scalability, that's the magic word.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a fantastic deep dive.
I had a good time.
Learned a ton, as always, and I hope our listeners did too. And remember, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole world of Wi-Fi knowledge out there, so...
Yeah, don't stop here.
Exactly. Check out those videos on SDN Tech Forum, read those technical documents, never stop learning.
I'm always learning something new.
Me too, and that's what makes it fun. All right, thanks for joining us, everyone. Until next time.